The blood-red sun dipped below the horizon as Penelope Owens watched the last stage out of Hot Springs disappear into the distant hills, taking with it her final chance of escape. She clutched the crumpled telegram in her trembling hand, the message from her dying father that would now go unanswered. Behind her, the heavy footsteps of Randall Blackburn, the ranch foreman who had become her jailer, crunched on the dirt road. "I told you, Miss Owens, nobody leaves Rocking Bee Ranch without Mr. Blackburn's permission," Randall said, his voice low and menacing as he gripped her arm. "And he ain't giving it to you or anyone else." The year was 1878, and Hot Springs, South Dakota, was still more frontier than civilization. Penelope had arrived just 6 months earlier to take a position as a schoolteacher, hoping to save enough money to eventually open her own school back east. Instead, she'd found herself trapped at the Rocking Bee, where owner Bernard Blackburn had decided her education made her the perfect bookkeeper for his increasingly suspicious business dealings. "My father is dying," Penelope said, fighting to keep her voice steady. At 22, she'd prided herself on her independence, but the isolation of the ranch and Blackburn's iron grip had slowly worn her down. "He asked for me. I have a right to go to him." Randall's fingers dug deeper into her arm as he pulled her toward the waiting buckboard. "Rights don't mean much out here, Miss Owens. You know too much about the boss's business. You ain't going nowhere." As he forced her onto the wagon seat, Penelope caught sight of a lone figure watching from the shadowed boardwalk in front of the general store. Even in the failing light, she could make out the lean frame and distinctive Stetson of Caleb Brookes, a cowboy who'd recently signed on with the Rocking Bee. Their eyes met briefly before Randall cracked the reins and the wagon lurched forward, carrying her back to her gilded prison. The Rocking Bee sprawled across 5,000 acres of prime grazing land, 15 miles outside Hot Springs. Bernard Blackburn had built his empire through ruthless acquisition of neighboring properties when drought and hard times forced sales. Penelope had been recording increasingly troubling transactions in the ranch ledger's cattle numbers that didn't match sales, land deeds with suspect signatures, and payments to men known locally as hired guns. When the wagon rolled into the ranch yard, the house loomed dark against the star-speckled sky. Bernard Blackburn stood on the porch, a cigar glowing like an evil eye in the darkness. "I hear you tried to leave us today, Miss Owens," he said as Randall roughly helped her down. "I'm disappointed." "I thought we had an understanding." "My father is dying," Penelope repeated, standing as straight as her 5'4" frame would allow. "I sent a telegram last week requesting permission to visit him. You never responded." Blackburn blew a plume of smoke toward the night sky. "This ranch doesn't run itself, my dear. Your accounting skills are too valuable to spare. I'm sure your father would understand business necessities." "This isn't about business," she said, her voice breaking. "This is about basic human decency." Blackburn laughed, a sound as dry as autumn leaves. "Decency is a luxury item out here, Miss Owens. Now, get inside. There's a shipment of cattle coming in tomorrow that needs to be properly documented." As Randall escorted her into the house, Penelope felt something inside her finally snap. 6 months of fear and compliance crystallized into determination. She would not die here forgotten and used. Somehow she would escape. Her room, though comfortable by frontier standards, was her prison. The window overlooked a 30-foot drop to rocky ground, no chance of escape there. The door would be locked from the outside, as it had been every night since she'd first threatened to leave. Penelope paced the floor, her mind racing. The telegram had been clear her father likely wouldn't last the week. A soft tap at her window startled her from her thoughts. Cautiously approaching, she saw a pebble bounce off the glass. Looking down, she could just make out a figure in the shadows below. When he stepped into a patch of moonlight, she recognized the angular features of Caleb Brookes. Penelope carefully opened the window. "What are you doing?" She whispered. "Checking if you're all right, Miss Owens," he called up softly. "I saw what happened in town." There was something in his voice, concern, perhaps, or understanding, that brought tears to her eyes. "My father is dying," she said, the words catching in her throat. "And they won't let me go to him." Even in the dim light, she could see his jaw tighten. "That ain't right," he said. "No one should be kept from family at such a time." "There's nothing I can do," Penelope said, wiping away a tear. "The ranch is 15 miles from town, and the next stage doesn't come for 3 days. By then." "There are other ways," Caleb said, his voice steady. "Be ready tomorrow night. Pack only what you need." Before she could ask what he meant, he disappeared back into the shadows, leaving Penelope with a dangerous flutter of hope in her chest. The next day dragged endlessly. Penelope went through her duties mechanically, recording figures in the ledger while her mind raced with possibilities and fears. What did Caleb have planned? Could she trust him? She'd had little interaction with the cowboy since his arrival at the ranch a month ago, but there had been moments a respectful tip of his hat, a kind word when Randall had berated her publicly, a quiet offer to carry heavy ledgers that suggested decency rare among Blackburn's men. As evening approached, Bernard Blackburn summoned her to his study. The room, like the man, was imposing yet vulgar expensive furnishings mixed with tasteless displays of wealth. Mounted animal heads stared down from the walls with glass eyes that seemed to follow her movements. "I've been reviewing your work, Miss Owens," Blackburn said, motioning her to sit across from his massive oak desk. "You've been very thorough." Penelope sat rigidly, hands folded in her lap. "I simply record the transactions as they occur, Mr. Blackburn." He studied her face, his eyes calculating. "And what do you think of these transactions?" "It's not my place to think, sir," she replied carefully. "Only to record." A slow smile spread across his face. "Smart girl, that's why you're valuable." He leaned forward. "So valuable that I've been considering a more permanent arrangement for your position here." Penelope's stomach turned. She'd seen this coming, the lingering touches, the inappropriate comments, the way his eyes followed her. At 45, Bernard Blackburn was a widower with a reputation for cycling through young female staff. "I'm honored by your consideration," she managed to say, "but I must return east eventually." "My father, your father, yes," he interrupted, waving a dismissive hand. "I've taken the liberty of sending inquiries about his condition." Penelope's breath caught. "You what?" "The telegram operator in town is quite cooperative when properly compensated," Blackburn said with a smug smile. "It seems your father passed away yesterday morning." The world seemed to tilt beneath her. Too late. She was too late. "I thought you should know," Blackburn continued, seemingly unmoved by her obvious distress. "So you can put aside this notion of leaving. There's nothing to go back to now." Penelope sat frozen, grief and rage battling within her. Her father gone, without her there to comfort him in his final moments, without her to say goodbye. "I'd still like to attend his funeral," she said, her voice hollow. Blackburn shook his head. "Not possible. The spring cattle drive preparations can't spare you." "But I've taken the liberty of sending a wreath in your name." He stood, coming around the desk to stand beside her chair. "Now, about that more permanent position I mentioned." His hand fell heavily on her shoulder. Penelope flinched away, rising quickly to her feet. "I need time," she said. "To grieve?" Something dark flashed in Blackburn's eyes, but he nodded. "Of course, a day or two, then we'll discuss your future here." He moved to the door, opening it for her. "Remember, Miss Owens, the Rocking Bee is your home now. The sooner you accept that, the happier you'll be." Back in her room, Penelope finally allowed her tears to flow freely. Her father, her kind, bookish father who had encouraged her education and independence, was gone, and she, trapped in this remote ranch, couldn't even say goodbye. Through her grief, though, a hard resolve formed. She would not remain here to become Blackburn's next conquest. Tonight, if Caleb Brookes offered a way out, she would take it, no matter the risk. As darkness fell, Penelope packed quickly and quietly a change of clothes, her mother's locket, the small amount of money she'd managed to save, and the letters from her father that were now all she had left of him. She changed into her most practical outfit, a dark blue riding skirt and white blouse, with sturdy boots. Then she sat on the edge of her bed and waited. The house grew quiet as the household retired. Penelope heard the now familiar sound of the key turning in her lock from the outside Randall's nightly ritual to ensure she remained where Blackburn wanted her. Then footsteps retreating down the hall. She waited another hour, her nerves stretched to breaking. Had Caleb forgotten, changed his mind? Just as despair began to creep in, she heard it the softest tap at her window. Rushing over, she saw Caleb on a ladder that hadn't been there earlier. He gestured for her to open the window. "Are you ready?" he whispered when she did. Penelope nodded, grabbing her small bag. "How do we get down?" "The ladder only reaches the roof of the porch," he explained. "From there, we'll have to be careful. I've saddled your horse and mine. They're waiting in the trees." With trembling hands, Penelope climbed out the window and onto the ladder. The night air was cool against her face, carrying the scent of sage and pine. Freedom. Carefully, she made her way down to the porch roof, Caleb close behind. Together they crept to the edge where he helped her down to the ground. "Stay low," he whispered, leading her around the side of the house toward the tree line. They had almost reached the shelter of the pines when a voice called out from the darkness. "That's far enough." Randall Blackburn stepped from the shadows, rifle in hand. Behind him stood two ranch hands, both armed. "Mr. Blackburn thought you might try something foolish," Randall said, his voice carrying in the still night air. "He'll be disappointed to learn one of his own men was helping you." Caleb pushed Penelope slightly behind him. "This isn't right, Randall. She's not property. Her father just died, for God's sake." "Not my concern," Randall replied coldly. "Mr. Blackburn's orders are what matter here." He gestured with the rifle. "Now both of you back to the house. Miss Owens to her room, and you, Brookes, to the barn where we can discuss your betrayal properly." Penelope felt Caleb tense beside her. "Run," he whispered. Before she could react, he lunged at Randall. The foreman's rifle discharged with a deafening crack, the bullet going wide as the two men collided. The other ranch hands rushed forward as Caleb and Randall grappled on the ground. "Run," Caleb shouted again, landing a solid punch that momentarily stunned the foreman. This time Penelope didn't hesitate. She bolted for the trees, heart pounding in her chest, the sounds of the struggle fading behind her. In the shelter of the pines, she found two horses tethered to a low branch, her own chestnut mare, Penny, and Caleb's gray gelding. Hands shaking, she untied both horses. She should flee now while she had the chance. But Caleb had risked everything to help her. She couldn't leave him. From the direction of the house came shouts and another gunshot. Penelope's blood ran cold. Mounting Penny, she led Caleb's horse back toward the edge of the trees, staying hidden in the shadows. From there, she could see the struggle continuing. Caleb had managed to disarm Randall, but the other two ranch hands were closing in. Taking a deep breath, Penelope burst from the tree line, riding hard toward the melee. The sudden appearance of the horse scattered the men. As she thundered past, she saw Caleb break free from his attackers. "Caleb," she called, bringing his horse alongside. With impressive agility, he grabbed the saddle horn and swung himself up onto his mount even as it galloped past. Behind them, Randall was shouting orders, and lights were coming on in the main house. "This way." Caleb called, taking the lead and guiding them away from the ranch buildings and toward the open range. They rode hard for nearly an hour, the sound of pursuit gradually fading behind them. Finally, in a small clearing beside a creek, Caleb signaled for them to stop and let the horses drink. "Are you hurt?" Penelope asked, noticing for the first time the dark stain on his sleeve. "Just grazed," he said, though his face was pale in the moonlight. "We need to keep moving. Once Blackburn realizes you're gone, he'll send men in all directions." "Why did you help me?" she asked as they dismounted briefly to rest the horses. Caleb's eyes met hers, serious in the silvery light. "Because what they were doing wasn't right. No one should be held against their will." He paused, looking away. "And because I've seen what happens to the women Blackburn takes a fancy to. None of them stay long and none leave happy." A chill ran through Penelope that had nothing to do with the night air. "Where can we go? They'll check the stage routes." "I know a place," Caleb said, checking the cinch on his saddle. "An old line shack about 20 miles west of here. It's on disputed land, not clearly Blackburn's or the neighboring ranches. We can rest there, figure out our next move." As they prepared to mount up again, hoofbeats sounded in the distance. Caleb's face hardened. "They're coming faster than I thought," he said, helping Penelope quickly into the saddle. "We need to split up." "No," Penelope protested. "They'll kill you if they catch you alone. And they'll drag you back if they catch us together," he countered, swinging up onto his own horse. "I'll lead them away. You head west, following this creek. The lined shack is in a stand of cottonwoods near where the creek forks. I'll meet you there." Before she could argue further, he leaned over and took her reins, securing them in her hands. "Ride fast, Penelope," he said, his eyes intense. "Don't stop for anything." With that, he wheeled his horse around and galloped off to the south, making as much noise as possible. Penelope sat frozen for a moment, torn between following his instructions and her fear for his safety. The approaching hoofbeats grew louder, deciding the matter for her. Turning Penny westward, she urged the mare into a gallop, following the moonlit ribbon of the creek. Behind her, she heard shouts as the pursuers discovered Caleb's trail and followed. Prayers formed on her lips as she rode for Caleb's safety, for her own escape, and for forgiveness that she hadn't reached her father in time. The terrain grew rougher as she followed the creek. Penny, sure-footed and steady, navigated the uneven ground with remarkable skill. Penelope leaned low over the mare's neck, whispering encouragement as they fled through the night. After what seemed like hours, the creek widened and forked, just as Caleb had described. Nearby stood a small stand of cottonwoods, skeletal in the moonlight. Among them, barely visible, was the dark outline of a small cabin. Penelope approached cautiously, alert for any sign of danger. The lined shack was little more than a one-room shelter with a small lean-to stable attached. It looked abandoned, the window shutters hanging crooked and the door secured with a simple leather latch. Dismounting, she led Penny to the lean-to, grateful to find some old hay inside. After seeing to her horse, Penelope cautiously entered the cabin, a match in hand to light her way. The interior was dusty but intact, a simple bed frame with a straw-filled mattress, a rough table and chair, a small cook stove, and shelves holding basic provisions. Lighting a stub of candle she found on the shelf, Penelope took stock of her situation. She was alone in the wilderness, pursued by dangerous men, with only the barest supplies and no clear plan beyond waiting for Caleb if he even managed to evade capture. For a moment, despair threatened to overwhelm her. Then she thought of her father, of how he'd always told her she had a spine of steel beneath her gentle exterior. "When the world pushes, Penny girl," he'd say, "you push back harder." With renewed determination, Penelope set about making the cabin defensible. She found an old rifle in a rack on the wall and checked that it was loaded. The shutters, though hanging askew, could be secured from inside. The door had a heavy wooden bar that could be dropped into place. That done, she allowed herself to sink onto the edge of the bed, the events of the day crashing down upon her. Her father was gone. She was a fugitive. And somewhere in the night, a man she barely knew was risking his life to help her escape. Dawn was just breaking when Penelope jerked awake, the sound of approaching hoofbeats pulling her from an exhausted slumber. Grabbing the rifle, she moved to the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. Her heart leapt when she recognized Caleb's gray gelding, then plummeted when she saw the rider slumped forward in the saddle. Setting the rifle aside, she rushed outside. Caleb barely managed to dismount before staggering, his face ashen in the early light. Only then did Penelope see the dark stain spreading across his side. "Not just a graze after all," he said with a weak attempt at a smile before his knees buckled. Penelope caught him as best she could, helping him into the cabin and onto the bed. His shirt was soaked with blood from a bullet wound in his side. "They were better shots than I gave them credit for," he said through gritted teeth as she helped him remove his shirt to examine the wound. "You need a doctor," Penelope said, her voice tight with worry. Caleb shook his head. "Can't risk it. Blackburn will have men watching every doctor within 50 miles. He winced as she probed gently around the wound. "Besides, I think the bullet went clean through, just need to stop the bleeding." Penelope tore strips from her petticoat to create bandages while Caleb talked her through cleaning the wound with whiskey from his saddlebags. His hands guided hers, steady despite his pain, as they worked together to bind the injury. "Did you lose them?" she asked as she tied off the bandage. "I think so," he said, easing back against the rough pillow with a grimace. "Led them on a wild chase through the Badlands before doubling back. Don't think they'll find this place anytime soon." Penelope finished tending to him, then sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly overcome with the enormity of their situation. I've ruined your life, she said quietly. You can never go back to the rocking bee. You've lost your job, your reputation. Wasn't much of a job anyway, Caleb said, his voice growing weaker. Blackburn's not the man he pretends to be. I was fixing to move on soon regardless. But why risk yourself for me? You hardly know me. Caleb's eyes, blue as a summer sky despite the pain clouding them, met hers directly. Sometimes you just know when something's not right. What Blackburn was doing, keeping you there against your will, that wasn't right. His simple moral clarity touched something deep within Penelope. In a world where men like Bernard Blackburn wielded power through fear and money, Caleb Brookes stood apart, a man guided by a personal code of honor. Rest now, she said, pulling a threadbare blanket over him. I'll keep watch. The day passed slowly. Penelope tended to Caleb, whose fever rose as infection set in despite their best efforts. He drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes talking lucidly about his life growing up on a small farm in Missouri, learning to break horses from his father, drifting west after the war took his parents and their land. Other times he rambled feverishly, calling out to people Penelope didn't know or reliving moments from his past. Between caring for him, she kept vigilant watch from the cabin's single window. Twice she thought she heard riders in the distance, but no one approached the line shack. As night fell again, she dared to build a small fire in the cook stove to prepare a broth from the meager supplies on the shelves. Smells good, Caleb said weakly when she brought the broth to him. He'd awakened more lucid, the fever having broken somewhat. It's just salt pork and beans, she apologized. Not much to work with here. Better than my cooking, he said with a shadow of his usual smile. Sitting up with her help, he managed to take a few spoonfuls before exhaustion claimed him again. As he slept, Penelope took stock of their provisions. They had enough food for perhaps 3 more days if they were careful. The creek provided water, but they couldn't stay here indefinitely. Eventually, Blackburn's men would widen their search, or the owners of the line shack might appear. They needed a plan. The next morning, Caleb was strong enough to sit up on his own. The wound looked cleaner, the angry red streaks around it beginning to fade. We need to get to a town where Blackburn doesn't have influence, he said as Penelope changed his bandage. Somewhere we can catch a train east. Rapid City, she suggested. Caleb shook his head. Too close. Blackburn has connections there, he thought for a moment. Cheyenne might be our best bet. It's a longer journey, but there's regular train service east and it's far enough from Blackburn's sphere of influence. How far is it? Penelope asked, her heart sinking at the thought of such a journey with an injured companion. About 200 miles, Caleb admitted. Not an easy ride, especially in my condition, but staying here isn't an option. Penelope knew he was right. We'll leave tomorrow, she decided. You need another day to regain strength. That night, as Caleb slept more peacefully, Penelope found herself studying his face in the soft glow of the candle. In repose, the hard lines of his features softened, revealing a gentleness she hadn't fully appreciated before. What kind of man risked everything for a woman he barely knew? The question circled in her mind as she finally drifted off to sleep in the chair beside the bed. Dawn brought a soft rain that pattered against the cabin's roof. Caleb insisted on helping prepare for their journey despite Penelope's protests. His movements were stiff and careful, but some color had returned to his face, and his eyes were clear. I've been thinking about our route, he said, as they shared a simple breakfast of cornbread and coffee. We should avoid the main trails. Blackburn will have men watching those. Penelope nodded, studying the crude map Caleb had sketched on a scrap of paper. What about supplies? We can't make it to Cheyenne on what we have here. There's a trading post about 50 miles southwest, Caleb said, pointing to a spot on the map. Run by an old trapper named Harding. He's no friend to the big ranchers. We can resupply there. By mid-morning, the rain had stopped and they were ready to depart. Penelope had packed what little food remained, along with the blankets and a pot for cooking. Caleb, moving carefully to avoid reopening his wound, saddled the horses and checked their shoes. We'll have to ride double for the first day or so, he said, eyeing his gray gelding critically. Storm here is the stronger of the 2 horses, and your mare can carry our supplies. Once we're farther from Blackburn's territory, we can look for another mount. The intimacy of sharing a saddle made Penelope's cheeks warm, but practicality overrode her maidenly concerns. Caleb helped her mount first, then swung up behind her with a barely suppressed groan of pain. "Are you sure you're well enough for this?" she asked, acutely aware of his chest against her back, his arms reaching around her to take the reins. "Don't have much choice," he replied, his breath warm against her ear. "Besides, I've ridden with worse." They set out heading southwest, keeping to the shelter of ravines and wooded areas where possible. Caleb proved to be an expert tracker and woodsman, reading the terrain with an ease that spoke of years spent in the wilderness. He pointed out signs that Penelope would have missed, entirely broken twigs that indicated recent passage, the pattern of birds taking flight that suggested riders in the distance. By midday, they had covered perhaps 15 miles, slow progress by Caleb's standards, but reasonable given his condition. They stopped in a sheltered hollow to rest the horses and eat a cold lunch. "You've been avoiding a question," Caleb said as they shared the last of the cornbread. "Where will you go once we reach Cheyenne, back east to your father's funeral?" Penelope looked away, the grief she'd been holding at bay threatening to surface. "I don't know. I have an aunt in Boston, but we've never been close, and with father gone." She swallowed hard. "The house will likely go to creditors. There's nothing really to go back to." "I'm sorry," Caleb said softly, "about your father and that you couldn't be with him." "Thank you," she whispered, fighting tears. After a moment she asked, "What about you? What will you do once we reach Cheyenne?" A shadow crossed Caleb's face. "I haven't thought that far ahead." "Find work, I suppose. That's always been my way, one job to the next, never staying too long in any place." "A wanderer," Penelope said, studying him. "Some might call it that," he agreed with a slight smile. "I prefer to think of it as being free to follow opportunity." They continued their journey through the afternoon, the landscape gradually changing from the rolling grasslands of South Dakota to more rugged terrain as they approached the Black Hills. Caleb grew quieter as the day wore on, and Penelope could feel the tension in his body as he fought against pain and exhaustion. When they finally made camp in the shelter of an overhanging rock, Caleb nearly fell from the saddle. Penelope helped him to the ground, alarmed at the fresh blood staining his bandage. "The wound's reopened," she said, easing him down onto their blanket. "I told you it was too soon to travel." "Had to," he mumbled, eyes closed against the pain. "Blackburn's men wouldn't have given up searching." Penelope built a small, smokeless fire and heated water to clean his wound again. As she worked, Caleb watched her through half-lidded eyes. "You have gentle hands," he said softly. "Like my mother did, she was a healer of sorts. People would come from miles around when they were sick or injured." "Is that where you learned about wounds?" Penelope asked, carefully applying a fresh bandage. He nodded. "She taught me what plants could heal and which would harm, how to set a bone and stitch a cut." A sad smile touched his lips. "She'd have liked you. Said you can tell a person's character by how they care for others in pain." "And what would she say about my character?" Penelope asked, trying to keep her tone light despite the strange flutter in her chest at his words. "That you have a good heart," he said simply, his blue eyes holding hers for a moment before exhaustion claimed him again. Penelope sat beside him long after he'd fallen asleep, watching the play of firelight on his weathered face. In the short time she'd known him, Caleb Brookes had shown more integrity and kindness than most men she'd encountered in her entire life. The thought of parting ways once they reached Cheyenne left a curious emptiness in her chest. The next morning dawned clear and cool. Caleb seemed stronger, the rest having done him good. They ate a sparse breakfast before continuing their journey, still riding double but with Caleb now able to sit straighter behind her. Around midday, they crested a ridge and saw spread before them a vast expanse of rugged country hills covered with pine and spruce, deep ravines cut by ancient waters, and in the distance, the blue shadows of mountains. "Beautiful," Penelope breathed, momentarily forgetting their precarious situation in the face of such grandeur. "This is why I stay out west," Caleb said, his voice close to her ear. "Something about this country speaks to me. It's hard and dangerous, but honest in its way." "The land doesn't lie about what it is, unlike people," Penelope observed. "Unlike some people," he corrected gently. There's good folks out here too, hard-working, decent people trying to build something, like your ideal community. She asked, remembering something he'd mentioned during his fever. Caleb was quiet for a moment. You heard that, huh? Just a dream, really. A place where people work together instead of trying to destroy each other. Where a man or woman is judged by their character, not their money or connections. It sounds wonderful, Penelope said softly. I hope you find it someday. Maybe we both will, he replied, and something in his tone made her heart skip a beat. They rode in companionable silence after that, making good time through the wilderness. By late afternoon, they reached a small valley where a crude cabin stood beside a swift-flowing stream Harding's trading post. The man who emerged at their approach was as weathered as the hills around them, tall and lean, with a gray beard that reached nearly to his belt and eyes sharp as a hawk's. He held a rifle casually in the crook of his arm, neither threatening nor entirely welcoming. Don't get many visitors these days, he called as they approached. His gaze sharpened as he took in Caleb's pallor and the way Penelope supported him. Looks like you've had some trouble. Could say that, Caleb replied. You'd be Harding, the old man nodded. Who's asking? Name's Caleb Brookes. This is Miss Penelope Owens. We're trying to reach Cheyenne Need Supplies. Harding studied them for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable, running from something or someone. Penelope tensed, but Caleb's hand squeezed her arm reassuringly. Bernard Blackburn of the Rocking Bee, he said frankly. Miss Owens was being held there against her will. I helped her leave. A slow smile spread across Harding's face, transforming his stern features. Well now, that puts a different complexion on things. Bernard Blackburn's no friend of mine, tried to run me off my land twice. He lowered his rifle completely. Come on in, let's see to that wound of yours and talk about those supplies. Harding's cabin was surprisingly comfortable inside, clean and well organized, with furs on the floor and shelves stocked with goods for trade. He helped Caleb to a chair by the fire, then brought out a box of medical supplies that would have impressed many town doctors. Learned from the Lakota, he explained as he examined Caleb's wound with practiced hands. They know more about healing than most white doctors. While he worked, Penelope explained their situation in greater detail, her imprisonment at the Rocking Bee, Caleb's intervention, and their need to reach Cheyenne undetected. Harding listened without interruption, his hands steady as he applied a poultice to Caleb's wound. When she finished, he sat back on his heels, thoughtful. Blackburn's a dangerous enemy, he said finally, but he's not the only power in these hills. There's others who'd be happy to see him taken down a peg. He looked from Penelope to Caleb. I can help you with supplies and directions to Cheyenne, but there's something else you should consider. What's that? Caleb asked, wincing as Harding secured a fresh bandage. Blackburn's business practices. The suspicious land deals you mentioned, Miss Owens. The territorial marshal in Deadwood has been trying to build a case against Blackburn for years, but witnesses have a way of disappearing. Or being held captive, Penelope said bitterly. Harding nodded. With your knowledge of his books and transactions, you could be the witness that finally brings him down. Penelope felt a chill run through her. The idea of facing Bernard Blackburn again, of testifying against him, terrified her. Yet there was justice in the thought too, for herself and for others he had wronged. It would be dangerous, Caleb said, watching her face closely. Blackburn wouldn't hesitate to silence you permanently if he knew what you were planning. I know, she said quietly. But if I run now, I'll be looking over my shoulder forever, and others will suffer as I did. Brave words, Harding said approvingly, but you'll need more than courage, you'll need evidence. The ledgers, Penelope said, thinking quickly. They're in Blackburn's study. Every questionable transaction is recorded there: land purchases with forged signatures, cattle numbers that don't match sales, payments to known gunmen. Getting those ledgers would be near impossible, Caleb objected. The ranch house is likely guarded day and night now. Maybe not, Harding said, stroking his beard thoughtfully. Blackburn's throwing a big party next week, some kind of harvest celebration. He does it every year, invites all the important folks from around the territory. The house will be full of guests, the attention divided. How do you know this? Caleb asked suspiciously. Harding grinned. I may be a hermit, but I keep my ears open. Information's as valuable as gold out here. He turned to Penelope. If you're serious about justice, that would be your chance. Slip in during the party, take the ledgers, and get out. It's too dangerous, Caleb said firmly. Blackburn and his men know what you look like, Penelope. You wouldn't make it past the front door. Not as she is now, Harding agreed, but with a proper disguise. He studied Penelope speculatively. The right dress, different hairstyle, perhaps some spectacles, you could pass as one of the society ladies from Rapid City. Caleb still looked unconvinced, but Penelope felt a growing determination. If I could get those ledgers to the marshal, would it be enough to arrest Blackburn? With your testimony, I believe it would, Harding said. Marshal Davis is an honest man. He's been after Blackburn for years. Then I want to try, Penelope said, meeting Caleb's concerned gaze. I can't run forever. Neither of us can. This might be our only chance to truly be free of Blackburn. Caleb held her eyes for a long moment before sighing deeply. If you're determined, then I'm with you, but we do this carefully, with a solid plan and no unnecessary risks. Harding slapped his knee, grinning broadly. Now that's settled, let's talk details. And first, you both need rest and a decent meal. Can't plan a proper heist on an empty stomach. The next few days at Harding's cabin were busy with preparations. The old trader proved to be not only a skilled healer, but a font of information about the territory and its people. With Caleb's wound healing well under Harding's care, they began plotting their approach to the rocking bee. The party's set for Saturday next, Harding said, unfolding a crude map of the ranch he'd drawn from memory. Blackburn always has musicians on the front porch, dancing in the main room and food served on the back terrace. The study, he pointed to a room off the main hall, is usually locked during such events, but Blackburn takes important guests there to show off his empire. So we need a key, Caleb mused, studying the layout. Or a distraction that draws Blackburn out long enough for Penelope to slip in, Harding suggested. They debated various approaches, with Penelope adding details about the house's layout and staffing. By the third day, a plan was taking shape, risky but potentially workable. I'll need appropriate clothing, Penelope said, considering the practical aspects. Nothing I have would pass as a society lady's attire. Harding disappeared into a back room, returning with a large trunk. My wife's things, he said, a shadow crossing his weathered face. She's been gone 15 years now, but I never could part with her belongings. She was about your size. Might be a bit old-fashioned, but quality never truly goes out of style. Opening the trunk revealed dresses of fine material and workmanship, not the height of current fashion perhaps, but elegant and well-preserved. Penelope lifted out a deep blue silk gown with modest lace trim. This is beautiful, she breathed. Martha wore that to the governor's ball in '62, Harding said, his voice soft with memory. She'd want it to be used for a good cause. Take what you need. Between fittings and planning sessions, Penelope found herself drawn to Caleb's company. As his strength returned, he helped Harding with chores around the trading post, demonstrating a versatility and work ethic that impressed both Penelope and their host. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, talking long into the night about their lives, hopes, and dreams. Penelope learned that Caleb had fought briefly for the Union before a wound sent him home, only to find his parents had died of fever and the farm had been seized for taxes. He drifted west afterward, working as a cowhand, scout, and occasionally as a marshal's deputy when funds ran low. I've never stayed anywhere long enough to put down roots, he admitted one night as they sat on Harding's porch watching the stars emerge. Always thought there'd be time for that later. And now, Penelope asked, acutely aware of his proximity in the darkness. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Now I'm starting to wonder what I've been looking for all these years. Maybe it wasn't a place at all. His eyes met hers in the dim light from the cabin window, and Penelope felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the mild evening. Before she could respond, Harding called them inside to discuss a refinement to their plan, and the moment passed. The night before they were to leave for the rocking bee, Penelope couldn't sleep. The enormity of what they were attempting pressed upon her, the dangers, the slim chance of success, the consequences of failure. Slipping outside for fresh air, she found Caleb already on the porch, smoking a hand-rolled cigarette. Couldn't sleep either. He asked, offering her a seat beside him on the bench. "Too much thinking," she admitted, pulling her shawl tighter against the night chill. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the soft chirping of crickets and the distant call of a night bird. "What will you do if this works?" Caleb finally asked. If Blackburn is arrested and you're truly free, Penelope had asked herself the same question repeatedly over the past days. "I still want to teach," she said slowly. "To have my own school someday, but I'm not sure where. The East doesn't feel like home anymore." "You could stay out west," Caleb suggested, his voice carefully neutral. "Plenty of growing towns that need good teachers." "And you," Penelope turned to face him, "what will you do when this is over?" Caleb stubbed out his cigarette, his expression thoughtful in the moonlight. "Been thinking about that. Harding mentioned that old Jenkins place about 20 miles from here is up for sale. Good water, decent grazing land, might be time to stop wandering." Penelope's heart quickened. "You'd become a rancher, on a small scale, yes. Never cared for the big operations like Blackburn's. Just a decent spread enough to make a living." He paused, then added quietly, "Though a man alone on a ranch has a hard time of it." The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but undeniable. Penelope found herself unable to look away from his face, from the question in his eyes that he hadn't quite put into words. Before either could speak further, the cabin door opened and Harding stepped out. "Thought I heard voices. Best get some rest, you two. Tomorrow's a big day." The moment broken, they returned inside, but Penelope carried the memory of it and the possibilities it suggested into her dreams. The journey to the rocking bee took most of the next day. Harding had provided them with a small wagon and team, more suited to their disguise as a married couple arriving for the celebration. Penelope wore one of Martha Harding's simpler dresses for travel, with the blue silk carefully packed for the evening. Caleb, clean-shaven and dressed in a decent suit that Harding had traded for years ago, looked a different man altogether. They stopped in a grove of trees about a mile from the ranch house as dusk approached. Other wagons and riders were already arriving for the party, providing the cover they needed. "Remember the plan," Caleb said as he helped Penelope change into the blue silk gown. His touch was respectful but lingering as he fastened the tiny buttons at her back. "If anything feels wrong, we leave immediately. No ledgers are worth your safety." Penelope nodded, her nerves making speech difficult. Her hair was arranged differently, pulled high with soft curls framing her face. Small spectacles perched on her nose and a touch of rouge brought color to her cheeks. Looking in the small mirror Harding had provided, she barely recognized herself. "You look beautiful," Caleb said softly, his eyes warm as they met hers in the mirror. "But then you always do." The simple compliment steadied her as nothing else could have. Turning to face him, Penelope straightened his tie, allowing her hands to rest briefly on his chest. "Be careful tonight," she said. "I couldn't bear it if something happened to you." "Nothing will happen to either of us," he promised, covering her hands with his own. For a moment they stood close enough that Penelope could feel his breath on her cheek, sense the barely contained tension in his body. Then, with obvious reluctance, he stepped back. "It's time." They joined the stream of guests arriving at the ranch house, their small wagon unremarkable among the various conveyances. Lanterns illuminated the yard, and music drifted from the porch where a small band played. Servants directed traffic and took the reins of horses. Caleb handed their team to a stable boy with a confident air of belonging, then offered his arm to Penelope. "Ready, Mrs. Brookes?" he asked, using their agreed-upon cover. "Yes, Mr. Brookes," she replied, slipping into the role of his wife with a naturalness that surprised her. They ascended the steps to the main house, where Bernard Blackburn himself stood greeting guests. Penelope's heart hammered in her chest, but she kept her eyes modestly downcast as Caleb presented their fraudulent invitation. "Charles and Patricia Brookes," he said smoothly, "from Rapid City. We're associates of Judge Hollister." It was a calculated risk. Hollister was known to be traveling in Europe, making verification of their connection impossible in the short term. Blackburn, clearly distracted by the dozens of guests arriving simultaneously, barely glanced at them. "Welcome to the Rocking Bee," he said perfunctorily, before turning to the next arrivals. Inside, the ranch house had been transformed. Furniture had been moved to create space for dancing, flowers adorned every surface, and servants circulated with trays of champagne. Penelope accepted a glass from a passing waiter, using it as a prop to partially obscure her face as she scanned the room. "Do you see Randall?" she whispered to Caleb. "By the fireplace," he murmured back. "Don't look directly at him. Let's move toward the back of the house." They circulated slowly through the crowded rooms, playing their parts as social guests while watching for opportunities. According to their plan, Caleb would create a distraction at the appropriate moment, allowing Penelope to slip into Blackburn's study and retrieve the ledgers. An hour into the party, their chance arrived. Blackburn was leading a group of important-looking men toward his study, clearly intending to show off his empire as Harding had predicted. Caleb squeezed Penelope's hand. "It's time," he said softly. "I'll start the distraction in 2 minutes. Be ready." With a final touch to her cheek that could have been mistaken for a husband's affection by observers, Caleb moved away toward the back terrace where the food was being served. Penelope drifted casually toward the hallway leading to the study, pretending to admire a painting on the wall. From outside came a sudden commotion, shouting, the crash of breaking glass, and women's screams. Through the windows, Penelope could see flames leaping up from a tablecloth Caleb had accidentally knocked into a lantern. As planned, the fire created instant chaos, drawing servants, guests, and most importantly Blackburn and his men outside to deal with the emergency. The moment the hallway cleared, Penelope slipped into the study. The room was exactly as she remembered it, ostentatious and imposing. Moving quickly to the massive oak desk, she began searching for the ledgers. They weren't in their usual place in the top drawer. Panic fluttered in her chest as she searched more frantically. Outside, she could hear the fire being brought under control. She had minutes at most before someone returned. Finally, behind a false panel in the desk that she remembered Blackburn accessing once, she found them 3 leather-bound books recording the ranch's business for the past 3 years. Gathering them quickly, she slipped them into the special pocket Harding had sewn into her petticoats. She was almost to the door when it opened. Randall Blackburn stood in the doorway, his eyes widening in recognition despite her disguise. "You," he snarled, reaching for her. Penelope reacted instinctively, grabbing a heavy paperweight from the desk and swinging it with all her might. It connected with Randall's temple with a sickening crack, and he crumpled to the floor. Shock froze her for a moment as she stared at his motionless form. Had she killed him? But a faint groan confirmed he was alive, merely stunned. Relief and renewed urgency propelled her forward. Stepping carefully over Randall, she slipped back into the hallway and made her way toward the front door, forcing herself to move at a casual pace despite her racing heart. Outside, the fire had been extinguished, and guests were returning to the house. Penelope caught Caleb's eye across the yard. He had been helping with the fire brigade, his suit jacket discarded and sleeves rolled up, playing the helpful guest to perfection. At her slight nod, his shoulders relaxed marginally. They had agreed to leave separately to avoid suspicion. Penelope was to make her way to the wagon while Caleb created one final distraction to cover their departure. She moved toward the side of the house, intending to circle around to where their wagon waited. "Mrs. Brookes, isn't it?" Bernard Blackburn's voice stopped her cold. He stood in the shadows of the porch, watching her with narrowed eyes. "Strange, but you remind me of someone." "Someone who disappeared recently." Penelope's mouth went dry, but she forced herself to turn and smile politely. "I'm afraid you're mistaken, Mr. Blackburn. My husband and I are just passing through the territory." Blackburn stepped closer, his scrutiny intense. "Take off those spectacles." Before she could respond, shouts erupted from the front of the house. Fire! Fire in the stables! Caleb's second distraction had begun larger and more serious than the first. Blackburn hesitated, torn between his suspicion and the new emergency. The sound of frightened horses decided him. "My stock!" he exclaimed, rushing toward the stables where flames were now visible. Penelope didn't waste the opportunity. Gathering her skirts, she ran for their wagon hidden in the trees beyond the yard. Caleb was already there, hitching the team with frantic speed. Hurry. He called as she approached. Someone found Randall. They know you're here. Behind them, men's voices shouted commands, and the sound of hoofbeats suggested pursuit was organizing. Caleb helped Penelope onto the wagon seat, then leapt up beside her and slapped the reins against the horses' backs. The wagon lurched forward just as riders appeared from the direction of the ranch house. "Hold on," Caleb urged, driving the team at a dangerous pace along the rough track. Bullets whizzed past them as Blackburn's men opened fire. Penelope clung to the seat, the ledgers heavy against her legs as Caleb navigated the treacherous path. His face was set in grim determination, his hands steady on the reins despite the danger. "There's a creek ahead," he shouted over the thunder of hooves and wheels. "We'll lose them in the water." The wagon bounced and swayed wildly as they descended a steep bank. Water sprayed as they hit the creek, the horses struggling to maintain their footing on the slick stones. Behind them, their pursuers were gaining. Reaching into his boot, Caleb withdrew a small pistol. "Take the reins," he ordered, thrusting them into Penelope's hands. She gripped them tightly, fighting to control the panicked team as Caleb turned and fired at their pursuers. One man fell from his horse with a cry. The others pulled up briefly, giving them a precious lead. "There," Caleb pointed ahead to where the creek entered a narrow ravine. "Once we're in there, they won't be able to follow side by side. It'll slow them down." The gambit worked. As the wagon careened into the ravine, the steep walls forced their pursuers into single file, reducing their advantage. Caleb took the reins back from Penelope, guiding the exhausted team through the treacherous passage. They emerged from the ravine into open country as the first light of dawn painted the eastern sky. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit had faded, at least temporarily. "We need to abandon the wagon," Caleb said, scanning the terrain. "They'll be expecting us to head for Deadwood and the Marshal. We need to throw them off." He guided the team into a dense stand of pines, where they quickly unhitched the horses. Loading their few possessions and the precious ledgers onto one mount, they set the other horse free with a slap to its rump, sending it galloping northward as a false trail. "We'll go on foot from here," Caleb said, taking Penelope's hand. "There's a hunting cabin Harding told me about 5 miles east. We can rest there before continuing to Deadwood." The journey on foot was arduous, particularly for Penelope in her fine dress and impractical shoes. Caleb finally tore away the bottom of her skirt to allow easier movement, his hands gentle but efficient. They moved as quickly as possible through the rough country, alert for any sign of pursuit. By midday, they reached the hunting cabin little more than a crude shelter, but solid enough to provide protection from the elements. Caleb cleared away cobwebs and dust while Penelope collapsed onto a rough bench, her feet blistered and bleeding. "Let me see," he said, kneeling before her and carefully removing her ruined shoes. His touch was tender as he examined her injuries, then tore strips from his own shirt to bind the worst blisters. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "This isn't what I wanted for you." Exhausted as she was, Penelope couldn't help but smile. "What did you want for me, Caleb Brookes?" He looked up at her, his blue eyes serious in his dirt-streaked face. "Safety, happiness." He paused, then added softly, "A chance. A chance for what?" She pressed, her heart beating faster despite her fatigue. Instead of answering, Caleb rose and moved to check their supplies. "We should eat something, then rest. It's another day's journey to Deadwood." They ate a simple meal of jerky and hardtack from the supplies Harding had provided, then took turns keeping watch while the other slept. Penelope's dreams were troubled by images of Randall falling, of Bernard Blackburn's suspicious eyes, of endless pursuit. She woke to Caleb gently shaking her shoulder. "It's time to go," he said. "I heard riders to the west. They might have found our trail." Moving as quietly as possible, they gathered their few belongings and the ledgers, then slipped from the cabin into the gathering dusk. Caleb had fashioned a crude walking stick for Penelope to ease her progress on her injured feet. They traveled through the night, guided by the stars and Caleb's unerring sense of direction. By dawn, they could see Deadwood in the distance, a rough mining town nestled in a gulch, its buildings straggling along the creek that gave the settlement its name. The marshal's office is on the main street, Caleb said as they paused to rest on a ridge overlooking the town. We'll go straight there. No stops, no detours. Penelope nodded wearily. The ledgers seemed to weigh 100 pounds in the makeshift sack she carried, and every step was agony on her bandaged feet. But the sight of the town and the promise of justice it represented renewed her determination. They were halfway down the slope toward Deadwood when the riders appeared. 6 men, led by Bernard Blackburn himself, emerging from the trees to their right. They had circled around, guessing their destination. Run. Caleb shouted, pulling Penelope toward a rocky outcropping that might provide some cover. They were too exposed, too slow. Before they could reach the rocks, the riders were upon them. Blackburn's gun gleamed in the morning light as he leveled it at Caleb's chest. I admire your tenacity, Blackburn said coldly. But this ends now. Hand over whatever you took from my study and perhaps I'll be merciful. Caleb stepped in front of Penelope, shielding her with his body. It's over, Blackburn. Your crimes are documented in those ledgers. Even if you kill us, others know. Others can be dealt with, Blackburn replied with chilling confidence. Now the ledgers. Penelope clutched the sack tighter, her mind racing. They were so close to Deadwood, to safety. If only there were a way to signal for help. The crack of a rifle shot split the air. One of Blackburn's men cried out, clutching his shoulder as he fell from his horse. More shots followed in quick succession, sending the other riders scrambling for cover. Federal Marshal, a voice bellowed from the direction of town. Drop your weapons. A group of mounted men appeared, badges glinting on their chests. Leading them was a tall man with iron-gray hair and a face weathered by years of frontier justice, Marshal Davis himself. Blackburn, rage contorting his features, swung his gun toward Caleb. If I'm going down, I'm taking you with me, he snarled. Penelope didn't think she acted. Throwing herself at Caleb, she knocked him sideways just as Blackburn fired. Pain exploded in her shoulder, spinning her to the ground. Penelope. Caleb's anguished cry seemed to come from very far away as darkness crowded the edges of her vision. The last thing she saw before consciousness fled was Caleb's face above hers, his blue eyes wild with fear, and something that looked remarkably like love. She woke to the unfamiliar sensation of a soft bed beneath her and clean sheets above. For a moment, she thought she dreamed it all, the escape, the chase, the shooting. Then the pain in her shoulder reminded her otherwise. Welcome back, a gentle voice said from beside the bed. Turning her head, Penelope saw a gray-haired woman in a plain dress sitting nearby, knitting in hand. Where am I? Penelope asked, her voice raspy from disuse. Doc Mitchell's place in Deadwood, the woman replied, setting aside her knitting to pour a glass of water. I'm his wife, Sarah. You've been our guest for 3 days now. 3 days. Penelope struggled to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at her wound. Caleb, the ledgers, Mrs. Mitchell helped her drink, then eased her back against the pillows. The young man's fine hasn't left your side except when the marshal needed his testimony. As for the ledgers, they're safe with the authorities. Bernard Blackburn and his men are in custody awaiting trial. Relief flooded through Penelope, followed immediately by renewed concern. I need to see Caleb. I'm here, his voice came from the doorway. He looked exhausted, with several days' growth of beard shadowing his jaw, but his eyes were bright as they found hers. I just stepped out to telegraph Harding about your condition, Mrs. Mitchell tactfully excused herself, leaving them alone. Caleb approached the bed slowly, as if afraid she might disappear. When he reached her side, he dropped to his knees, taking her hand in both of his. I thought I'd lost you, he said, his voice rough with emotion. When you fell when I saw the blood. I couldn't let him hurt you, Penelope said simply. Not after everything you risked for me. Caleb brought her hand to his lips, pressing a fervent kiss to her knuckles. Don't you understand? None of that matters if you're not. He couldn't finish the sentence, emotion overtaking him. Penelope reached out with her good arm, her fingers tracing the worry lines etched into his forehead. I'm still here, she assured him. We both are. Over the next week, as Penelope recovered in the doctor's house, the full story emerged. Marshal Davis had been building a case against Blackburn for years, as Harding had said, but lacked concrete evidence. The ledgers Penelope provided, combined with her testimony about Blackburn's operations, were exactly what he needed. Harding himself arrived in Deadwood 3 days after the shooting, bringing news that the Rocking Bee was in chaos. With Blackburn and his foreman in custody, the legitimate hands had taken control, ensuring the stock was properly cared for while ownership was determined. The territorial governors involved now, Harding reported as he sat with them in Doc Mitchell's parlor. Seems Blackburn had his fingers in more pies than anyone realized. Land fraud, cattle rustling, even mail tampering to intercept legal notices. He'll be going away for a long time. What about Randall? Penelope asked, still troubled by the memory of striking the foreman. Concussion and a nasty headache, but he'll live to stand trial alongside his boss, Marshall Davis assured her when he visited later that day. You did what you had to do, Miss Owens. As her strength returned, Penelope began considering her future. The territorial governor, grateful for her role in Blackburn's downfall, had offered her a teaching position at the new school in Rapid City. It was a tempting opportunity, security, respect, the chance to pursue her dream of education. Yet something held her back from accepting immediately. That something was usually sitting beside her bed, reading to her from dog-eared books, or simply keeping her company in comfortable silence. Caleb had changed in subtle ways since their ordeal. The restlessness that had marked him before seemed diminished, replaced by a quiet certainty. He spoke more often of the Jenkins place. Harding had mentioned the small ranch that might be for sale. It needs work, he told her one evening as they sat on the porch of Doc Mitchell's house, watching the sunset paint Deadwood's rough buildings in gold. The house is solid but small, the corrals need rebuilding, but the water's good and there's enough grazing for a modest herd. It sounds lovely, Penelope said, watching his face as he described the property. A good place to stop wandering. Caleb turned to her then, his expression suddenly serious. That's what I've been thinking, that maybe it's time to build something instead of just passing through. Alone. Penelope asked, her heart in her throat. He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against hers. That depends on you, Penelope. On me. I know we haven't known each other long, he said, the words coming faster now as if he'd rehearsed them but was still afraid of her response. And I know you have dreams of your own teaching, having your own school. I wouldn't ask you to give those up, but I hoped. What did you hope, Caleb? Penelope encouraged softly when he faltered. He took a deep breath. I hoped you might consider building those dreams alongside mine. There's a need for education in the smaller settlements. The Jenkins place could be a home and a small ranch for us, with a schoolroom added on for children from the surrounding homesteads. Us. Penelope repeated, wanting to be absolutely clear about what he was proposing. Caleb slid from his chair to kneel before her, still holding her hand. Penelope Owens, I know our acquaintance has been unusual to say the least. But somewhere between you threatening to brain me for breaking into your room and me carrying you bleeding down that hill to Deadwood, I fell in love with you. Your courage, your kindness, your determination, everything about you. I can't imagine my life without you in it anymore. Tears filled Penelope's eyes as he continued. I'm not a wealthy man, and I can't offer you the kind of life you might have had back east, but I can offer you my heart, my hands to work alongside yours, and my promise to love and cherish you all the days of my life. Will you marry me? The answer came from her heart without hesitation. Yes, Caleb, yes, I will. His face transformed with joy as he rose to gather her carefully in his arms, mindful of her healing shoulder. The kiss they shared was tender at first, then deepened with the promise of a shared future neither had dared hope for just weeks earlier. They were married a month later in Deadwood's small church, with Harding giving the bride away and Doc and Mrs. Mitchell serving as witnesses. Penelope wore Martha Harding's blue silk dress, now properly altered to fit her perfectly and with the bullet hole meticulously repaired. After the ceremony, Marshall Davis presented them with an unexpected wedding gift, the deed to the Jenkins property, purchased with reward money from the territorial government for their role in Blackburn's capture. It seems fitting, the marshal said gruffly. That land was one of Blackburn's first fraudulent acquisitions. Now it'll be put to good use by honest folk. They moved to their new home as spring transformed the hills from brown to green. The small ranch house, though basic, was solid and clean. Together they worked from dawn to dusk, repairing fences, planting a garden, adding a small room that would serve as a classroom. Word spread quickly through the scattered homesteads that a proper teacher had arrived in the area. By summer's end, 7 children were making the daily trek to the Brookes Ranch for lessons, a beginning that filled Penelope with pride and purpose. Caleb, true to his word, built up a small but healthy herd of cattle, enough to provide a comfortable living without the cutthroat ambition that had corrupted men like Blackburn. In the evenings, they would sit on their porch, watching the sunset paint the hills gold and purple, marveling at how their separate dreams had woven together into something stronger and more beautiful than either had imagined. Bernard Blackburn's trial that fall was the sensation of the territory. Penelope's testimony, along with the evidence from the ledgers, ensured a conviction that sent him to prison for 20 years. Randall and several other conspirators received shorter sentences, but long enough to ensure justice was served. As winter settled over the hills, bringing snow and quiet days, Penelope and Caleb found deeper rhythms in their shared life. The schoolroom became a gathering place for the community, hosting Christmas celebrations, quilting bees, and occasionally serving as a makeshift church when traveling preachers passed through. One snowy evening, as they sat by their fire with Caleb reading aloud from David Copperfield, her father's favorite novel, Penelope felt a curious flutter in her abdomen. Placing a hand there, she felt it again, the first movements of the child they had created together. "Caleb," she said softly, interrupting the reading, "come here." Setting aside the book, he moved to kneel beside her chair. She took his hand and placed it on her rounded belly. His expression of wonder when he felt the baby move brought tears to her eyes. "That's our child," he whispered, awe in his voice. "Our future," Penelope agreed, covering his hand with hers. "A future I never imagined when I first came west. Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "The path that brought you here, all the danger and hardship." Penelope considered the question seriously, thinking of all she had endured: the imprisonment at the Rocking Bee, the desperate escape, the bullet she still carried in her shoulder that ached when storms approached. Then she looked at the man beside her, at the home they had built together, at the life growing within her. "Not for a moment," she said truthfully. "Every step of that path, however difficult, led me to you, to this. I wouldn't change a single one." Caleb's smile was tender as he leaned up to kiss her. "Nor would I," he murmured against her lips. "Not a single step." In the spring, when wildflowers dotted the hills and new calves wobbled beside their mothers in the pastures, their son was born, a strong, healthy boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's determined spirit. They named him Thomas, after Penelope's father. As she held her son in the quiet dawn, Caleb sleeping beside them after the long night of labor, Penelope thought about the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. From a frightened prisoner watching the stage leave without her, to a woman with a family, a home, and a purpose. She thought of that desperate night when the ranch foreman wouldn't let her leave, and the brave cowboy who had saddled her horse and told her to ride fast. How those moments of danger and courage had somehow blossomed into the deepest love she had ever known. Outside their window, the eastern sky lightened with promise. Another day was beginning on the small ranch they now called home, a day of work and purpose, of teaching and learning, of building and growing, a day of love. Penelope Brookes, no longer a prisoner of fear or circumstance, smiled down at her sleeping son and whispered the truth she had learned in the wild heart of the West. Sometimes the journey you fear most leads you exactly where you're meant to be.